Hello, World Civ guys. Welcome to the Puyi channel, which today we're going to revisit after we have a short lecture about the progress of the war. We have to keep making progress because we have to finish this unit, which is kind of lengthy, as well as the Cold War unit before we have the final exam. And so, pushing onward. Roman numeral 17 with Operation Torch, and once again, Operation Torch was the liberation of North Africa by the Allies. The Allied powers then hopped over to Sicily and the Italian peninsula. Yes, here's Sicily, and this is the Italian peninsula. That was the next route. So, Italy proved to be more of a liability to the Germans. In fact, there's a question on your test, about the Italians as well. Basically, the Italians were terrible. I'm telling you, Germany wishes they had never met the guys because they were always having to bail them out. Now, the Italians were easily the worst soldiers of the entire war. And it really wasn't their fault. They fought for a leader that didn't care about them, and they knew it. Most of the Italian soldiers were peasants. They were under equipped. They were poorly led. And like I said, they fought for Mussolini, and Mussolini cared about Mussolini. End of story. So, so Italy was more of a liability to the Germans than an asset, as it had to be. Italy had to be defended from the British and American invasion with mostly German soldiers. The Italians surrendered in droves as the Allied invasion crawled up the boot of Italy. The weather, while they don't have snow so much in Italy, except in the Alps, they do have rain, and that became a problem. And the increasingly rough terrain made the going continually slower, and the Germans put up a good defense. It did not matter, even when Mussolini had to be rescued from his own people by the Nazis, which they did. The Germans eventually deserted him, however, and Mussolini will eventually be captured and shot by his own people, and he and his latest girlfriend will be hung up by their feet in the town square. But with progress bogged down in Italy, Stalin's demands for this second front to relieve his beleaguered nation were renewed, and Churchill and Roosevelt finally relented. Now, the question was, where was this second front, second invasion, going to come from? And when was it going to happen? Long before D-Day, which, by the way, D-Day is June the 6th, 1944, eventually. The site of the invasion had been chosen as the Normandy region of northern France. Normandy, by the way, comes from the fact that this land was once settled by Vikings, the Norsemen, and so it became known as Normandy. And I mean, yeah, but there was all kind of cool stories about it. See, because it's very difficult to sneak a million soldiers across the English Channel or to launch an invasion that takes hundreds of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, and all sorts of material without tipping your hand. And so they use deception. For example, rubber tanks. You're welcome. Anyway, no, rubber tanks. For example, this is interesting. Uh, the Germans sent spy planes flying over England to watch what the Americans and British were doing. So they'd get an inkling of where this invasion was coming from. And so the Americans and British played what you call a shell game with them. And what they did, they constructed entire military bases and populated those military bases with tanks made out of they were balloons. In fact, I've seen pictures where it shows a serviceman holding up a tank because it's a balloon. But from the air, it looks like a tank. And they would put in a couple of three tanks who would kind of troll around the base, so it would give it the effect of looking live. And the same thing with airfields. They did the same thing with airfields, made airplanes out of paper mache. But from the air, looked really real. Timing was another thing. Good weather was needed. You had to have good weather, which, in Europe, good weather is kind of unpredictable. I was in Europe in 1989. It rained every other day, and rain is a detriment to air support. Also, you need high tides. You need a high tide because if you're going to drop a bunch of soldiers off, you need water. That way you can get your landing craft as far up the beach as you can. That way the soldiers don't have to run across such a long open field where they could be slaughtered, which is basically what happened. I'm not going to show you Saving Private Ryan, but if you ever want to see, yeah, you should. If you ever want to see what D-Day was like, tell your mom to put her fingers in her ears and and tell your little brothers and sisters look the other way and watch the first 30 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. It is like watching a meat grinder. That's why I won't show it. It's horrifying. So when the invasion was launched, what chances of success did Eisenhower, the commander of the Allied forces, give it? He gave it about a chance of 1 in 2 of succeeding. Who commanded the German defenses of Normandy? None other than Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the hero of North Africa, had built a formidable defense system in France. Where was he on June 4th? His wife had taken ill and he'd gone back to Berlin. It was luck. At some points, the invading forces suffered 90% casualties, such as in Omaha Beach. But what tactic does an invading soldier take against a fixed and fortified machine gun position? Move. And what you do, you move in small groups. In fact, no groups if you can get away with it. Machine guns won't be wasting ammo on one guy running across a field, but if you're in a group, yeah, they'll cut you to pieces. In other places, the invasion faced almost no resistance at all. Once the beaches of Normandy were secured, Allied men and machines poured in. This is where the superiority of the American war machine began to take its toll on the Germans. Because a couple of things. Number one, there were so many of them. I mean, there were so many. The Sherman tank was inferior to the German Tiger and Panzer tanks, but there were so many of them that kept coming. And not only that, the bigger thing was everything was mobility. What were the most unmatched American weapons? We went over this before. The American Jeep, the American quarter-ton truck. I'm sorry, the ton-and-a-half truck. Forgive me. Yeah, the ton-and-a-half truck, and finally the C-47 cargo plane. Everything that could move items, could move supplies, could move medical equipment, could move construction material, could move soldiers, and move it faster. Because what most people don't know is while the Germans had really fast moving war machinery, guns, tanks, things like that, to move their material, to move their supplies, they were largely still dependent on horses. Most people don't realize that. Horses still played a big part in World War II for the Axis, and that was a definite disadvantage. Valkyrie, yes, Valkyrie was a lot of the German high command, as the war began to wear on, became more and more dissatisfied with Adolf Hitler because he was not a good general. He allowed an entire army to be consumed and destroyed in the Stalingrad. There were other times where his stubbornness got people killed unnecessarily. And so, yeah, on July 20th, 1944, a bunch of his own officers, actually attended a meeting. And at the meeting, one of them, and this was all planned, got up and left the meeting. But he left his briefcase, and in the briefcase was dynamite with a timer. Now, it just so happened that Adolf Hitler, at the very right time, received a phone call. He left the room as well. He was slightly injured when the bomb went off. But they quickly figured out who did it, and that was the guy who not only left the meeting, but he left the entire camp. They traced it then. They killed or they shot or, in the case of Erwin Rommel was in on this. Erwin Rommel was allowed to commit suicide. And so he committed suicide because he was a national hero. All right, part G. With the Russians closing now from the east and the British and Americans closing from the west and the south of France, German options became fewer and more desperate. Will you pardon me? In the winter of 1944 and 45, the Germans tried to drive a wedge between the British and American lines in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. And because of that, the 182nd Airborne Division got trapped and surrounded in the Ardennes forest and were cut off, surrounded by Germans, and had summer clothing. And through the winter of 1944, 1945, it was, some of those soldiers say they could never get warm again after that. Why did the Americans do this to the British and Americans and not to the Russians on the Eastern Front? Because the Russians on the Eastern Front, they would not bulge. They would not budge. And actually, the Germans were hoping that perhaps the British and Americans might be persuaded to some sort of compromise, might even be persuaded, if they were successful in this attack, to turn around and face the Russians. So, by spring 1945, things were becoming quickly unraveled for the Third Reich. All the major cities, particularly in northern Germany, but not so much in southern Germany because of its proximity to England, where the air bases were in ruins from nighttime and daylight bombings from a sky that all the German airplanes had been swept clean by this time. The Americans introduced the P-51, which was a long-range and very fast fighter plane that could sweep down the German planes and allow those B-17s to just roll right into Germany and drop their cargoes. The Russians were showing no signs of either slowing down or mercy as they drove towards the old traditional German capital in Berlin. Americans and British tanks were now rolling across the Rhine, and for the first time since Napoleon in 1812, for the first time since Napoleon, the nation of Germany was being overrun by foreigners. Mass surrenderings on the Western Front, where they were still allowed, but not the Eastern. So Germans couldn't surrender on the Eastern Front. The Russians weren't in the mood to take prisoners. Mutinies on the ocean, desertions. Heinrich Himmler himself dressed up as a corporal and tried to escape in the ranks, and armies of boys and old men became typical of the German army, just like in World War I. Russian, British, and American armies began stumbling into large camps of so-called undesirables, and the truth about the final solution began to come to its realization. Munich, Dachau, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen. And then on April 30th, 1945, the day after he married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, Adolf Hitler and his bride committed suicide to escape the vengeance of the oncoming Russian army, who stood literally at the gates. And that date, April 30th, a lot of bad acts have been transpired on April 30th, who stood literally at the gates of Berlin. On May 7th, 1945, Admiral Donitz, the ranking German officer, signed the German unconditional surrender to the Allies. One of the little known and uglier secrets of the end of World War II was that the Russian general staff turned their backs and allowed the Russian army to pillage and loot the old historic capital of Berlin for 3 full days. And by the way, that pillaging was, they stole stuff, but they brutalized women. They raped women. 3 days, and there was nothing anybody could do. It was said that somewhere like 60,000 Berliners committed suicide because of what happened that week. In the end, the war in Europe was called VD. The end of the war in Europe was called VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, and was greatly celebrated around the globe. And that is where we'll end and pick up again tomorrow. And we